Welcome, everyone. I'm Haley Hansen. I'm the leader of the Higher Education Group at Husch Blackwell. We want to thank you for joining our program today. Before we begin, I'd like to cover some housekeeping items. First, at the bottom of your audience console, there are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have questions during the webinar, please submit them via the question box. We honestly anticipate taking the entire hour, and those of you who've been on webinars with me before know that's true, just to go over the content. So we will likely be either responding via chat to you or sending you an email follow-up with any of the email or any of the questions that you submit via this box. Also, there is a PDF of the presentation which is available for you right now to download through Program Materials folder, so you're welcome to do that. This program has been approved for continuing legal education hours, and to report your hours, please click on the CEU icon at the bottom of the screen. A certificate of attendance, including the course number, will be emailed to you tomorrow, along with a recording of the webinar that you can watch and share with anyone else on your campus that may have missed it today. Towards the end of the program, be sure to complete our short survey. We take this information and your feedback to try to plan future programs that are applicable to our colleges and universities. I'm very happy today to be presenting with Ellen Armentrout. Ellen is a wonderful member of our team and is committed to assisting higher education clients with their compliance needs. She has a long background in the academic world and understands the unique issues facing higher education clients. She's very passionate about Clery, which I love because I am as well, so we may get in some discussions today about what we think of some of the issues that we're posing, and Ellen is a wonderful resource to our clients. So Ellen, thanks so much for joining us today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
That's all for the housekeeping items. So Ellen, I'm going to go ahead and get this program started. So we have a full agenda for you today. First, we're going to start with just some overarching basic principles regarding your annual security report requirements. It's always great to just go over these again, just keep them fresh in your mind as you're getting ready for the deadline on October 1st. Then we're going to talk about common mistakes and how to avoid them. And then really looking at the gray areas and other questions that we get frequently. So Ellen and I will kind of go through some frequently asked questions and answer them for you as we get into the latter part of the webinar. So let's begin with overarching annual security report requirements. As most of you should know, you are required to publish on or before October 1st of each year your annual security report. It's really important as you look at your overarching requirements to determine who actually is going to get this report and how it will be distributed. And we're going to go into some detail about that and what we've seen are appropriate ways to distribute. It's been interesting to see in some of the most recent audits that have been published by the department that this has been an area in which compliance has really been a concern for the department in terms of who is actually receiving it and has access to this report and how it can be used. So I think that's really important as you look at these overarching requirements. Making sure that you include all your required policy statements, and there's a lot of them to include depending on whether or not you have on-campus housing or not. It can be over 100 different types, different statements. So making sure that you have all of those in your annual security report, including your 3 years of crime statistics, and then also making sure that you have maintained your records associated with the reports. And we think it's important as well to make sure that you have a records retention policy that talks about your Clery requirements so that that aligns if you have an audit or the department comes in and wants to see how you've maintained these records over the course of time. So we get this question a lot, why does compliance matter? I mean, we do see from the department that there's a fairly small percentage of of schools that actually get a full-blown Clery audit on an annual basis of what the department can do. So why are we putting all of this time and money and effort into this? And the most important reason is the security of the campus environment and making sure that people feel secured and have access to information. Also to protect the institution's reputation in terms of making sure that you are appropriately reporting. And then the stick versus the carrot approaches are that there are possible fines, and that each fine can be, per violation, $67,000 and continues to climb each and every year. And so as we've seen these fines really ratchet up over time, and the number of fines that we're seeing in the audits that are being conducted, the numbers can get very big very quickly. And so making sure that you're aware of that and that you understand, if you do go through a program review with your federal financial aid office, that you are cognizant that Clery is one of the things that they look at, and that at times then if the department is not satisfied with what it finds during your financial aid review, they will then submit that to the Clery team, and a potential Clery audit could happen. So those fines can really add up very, very quickly. And then possible continued oversight by the department if there is a finding of noncompliance. That is a possibility that the department can do as well. So compliance matters on a variety of levels, and it's really important to understand, and I'm going to say this kind of multiple times, that this is an institutional responsibility and should be a priority of the institution to make sure that you have met the Clery requirements and that you're doing all that you can to keep the campus as safe as possible. Now that we've got the basics completed, let's really talk about what are some common mistakes that we see on annual security reports, and what are some ways in which you need to try to avoid those common mistakes. It's that time in the webinar that we're launching our first poll question. So our first poll question today is the annual security report your institution publishes on October 1st of this year your 2023 ASR with your 2023 policy statements? Is it your 2022 ASR with your 2022 policy statements? Or is it your 2023 ASR with your 2022 policy statements? And we're going to give you just a minute to lock in your answer. Ellen, you'd think that this is kind of an easy one, but honestly, it gets a little confusing for people. Wouldn't you agree?
I would agree, and I will tell you, back in my early days as a higher ed attorney, this was something that I myself struggled with a little bit. So that's one of the reasons I thought it might be helpful to include as a poll question here, because I do think it gets confusing.
I do too, so let's see our results. Thank you for your responses. As you can see up on the slide, a lot of you texted in your responses, and those of you who answered the question correctly texted in the first response. So it is your 2023 ASR with your 2023 policy statements. And a lot of people get about this because they think, oh, well, these policy statements or changes were made in the summer of 2023 and therefore wouldn't have been in effect when these crimes were reported, and so therefore we should be using policy statements that were in effect at the time that the crime was reported, and that's not accurate. The department wants to make sure that the policy statements are the most up-to-date, accurate policy statements, so anyone going to your ASR can make sure that they see what your current policy statements are regarding your Clery policy statements. So I think it's important to understand that distinction, and that even if you make changes this summer to you could make changes to a variety of policies, that's what you need to include. It also reinforces the need that this is a campus-wide document, because we need to understand whoever's in charge of Clery. Typically that's going to be somebody within your law enforcement or your security department, that they are aware of policy changes that may have occurred across campus as well, and that there's that communication to really understand what is the most up-to-date policy statement. And you'd be surprised how many times Ellen and I go onto a university website and find multiple statements that say different things that are supposed to be the same policy. So making sure, again, you have the most up-to-date, accurate policy statements. What is the biggest mistake that Ellen and I see by institutions? It is that you wait too long. you get to September 15th and think, oh my goodness, I don't have my ASR done. And you start, looking and pulling together pieces, and it's in a panic, and there's not enough time, and there's not enough people engaged across campus. And to avoid all that, you need to start early. Start now. Make sure that you already have your previous 3 years of crime statistics ready to go. So you need to get your policy statements going. You need to make sure that your relevant stakeholders, on your Clery committee or whatever committee is reviewing this for you, has time on their calendar to start looking at this, that this is blocked off. We like to tell people, give yourself a September 1st deadline so you really push this through, because there's so many things that happen at the beginning of school that tend to get in the way, or fires that need to be put out, or other things like that, that if you start early, the better your ASR is going to be. And then anticipate that you're going to have some issues that you need a little bit more time to follow up on, and giving yourself that time really helps in the long term to make sure that you have an accurate annual security report that is published by October 1st. The next tip we will give you is to make sure you've included all the requirements, that information is all in the document. And that includes drug and alcohol section. That's the only place in which you can cross-reference or provide links. And so it's really important that everything is included and that you check off all of these boxes. A lot of times people think, oh, that doesn't apply to us. We don't have this, so we just won't include anything. Then you need to write, we don't have this particular thing, or whatever the statement is. You can't just skip over one of the requirements because you don't think it applies to you. You need to make sure that it is thoroughly addressed in your annual security report. Multiple campus locations is an area in which we get the most questions when it comes to what do we do for our ASR. And as we even look at where people make the majority of mistakes, a lot of times it happens to be in Clery geography that people make mistakes of, what is non-campus property versus a separate campus. Those types of determinations. So be very careful as you're looking at your Clery geography. It's always a good time to just double check and make sure that you've appropriately classified your Clery geography. And then as you're looking at multiple campuses for your annual security report, a couple of things. The department doesn't care if you put it all together in one document. That's fine. Or if you separate out multiple campuses into different documents. So it's up to you to make determination. What they do care about is that you have ensured that all of the policy statements, which we've talked about, are specific to that campus location. And so you have to state all of the policy statements for all of the locations. Even if you have one university or college policy on a particular subject, you need to make sure that it is the excerpt that you're talking about regarding safety or the information is included in each campus location. You also, that includes building access and security, reporting obligations, any of the trainings, timely warnings. Those are all pieces of this that have to be for each campus that you are reporting on. Also, consider issuing a separate ASR for each campus location. Again, I think that makes it easier to make sure you've complied. It is not required, as I said earlier. You can have one enormous document if you have a lot of locations and put them all together if that's the way you choose to do it. We think it makes it cleaner if you have just separate documents with your separate location. Again, up to you and your committee to determine what's best for your institution. So I talked about this in the introduction of who gets the report. Again, something that we've seen the department really take a close look at when it comes to Clery audits. You need to make sure that this report is provided to prospective students and prospective employees, as well as current students and employees. And again, as we talk through how this is going to be given to those or distributed, you need to make sure that the appropriate links are provided to all of those individuals. And that includes placing something on your admissions pages or on your application page so that people can be linked to the annual security report, and that you're making sure that those links actually work. That's been another area of broken links in which things don't actually work for prospective or students or prospective employees. A lot of times there is documentation of getting it to your current students and employees, but not to the prospective employees and students, and that's something that you will be asked for if your institution is audited. So common report distribution issues are not including information on how to obtain a hard copy of the report, where that can be. Also, you need to include a brief description of the contents of the report. It is not sufficient to send out an email to current employees and current students that says, here's a link to our annual security report. That is not sufficient. You must include in that email a notification of the description of the contents of the report. And typically that's a couple paragraphs at least, especially when you have 50, 60, 100, plus page document that's going out with your annual security report. So make sure that you do have a brief description. And then another common mistake is not including the exact electronic address of the report, or having some sort of broken links to the report, or the worst case scenario that we've seen is linking to a previous report, so distributing the 2022 ASR again. We've seen that happen, that they use the same link and it goes back to that report and not the current report that was supposed to be given out. So think about all those ways as to how you're going to distribute the report. The other best practice that Ellen and I really talk to schools about is making sure, again, it does say current employees, prospective employees, and current students and employees. I also think it's really important that you get this to your board, and that your board, they may not be current employees of your board, but your board have access to the annual security report. And that's important for governance issues as well as their fiduciary responsibilities as well.
Okay, everyone, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the required policy statements, and in particular some required policy statements that we often see getting sort of mishandled sometimes or omitted. And so I wanted to raise these as issues so that you all know moving forward best practices and how to avoid some mistakes. So we're going to start with some of the general safety and security policies, safety and security policies that need to be addressed in your ASR. You need to specify whether your campus police department, or in some cases campus security department, has arrest authority. We see sometimes some of our smaller schools that don't have campus police will just omit this statement. It is perfectly acceptable in your ASR to say our public safety department employees do not have arrest authority, but you've got to address it one way or the other. You've got to say if there's arrest authority or if there isn't. The same is true regarding whether you have any memoranda of understanding with local law enforcement, other police departments. It's absolutely fine if you don't have those, but you need to specify one way or the other. This goes back to what Haley was saying earlier. You cannot simply ignore a requirement just because you don't think it applies to you. You need to say, we do have an MOU with this department, or we do not. A lot of times if you don't, you'll say, but we still have a good working relationship with the local police department. You need to specify that institution staff will assist with making reports to the police, and you need to describe how to make anonymous reports if that's something that your institution has the capability of. We also recommend explaining confidential reporting and the differences between reporting to Title IX and other types of behavior. Frequently we'll see in someone's ASR that it says, we allow confidential reporting, names of alleged victims will not be shared. And then we'll go look at the Title IX policy, which indicates that that is not actually the case. So this is an important, it's an important point. You don't want internal inconsistencies, and so if you talk about confidential reporting, it needs to be more than simply a blanket statement. It needs to accurately reflect what happens and what is allowed at your institution. Some more safety and security policy statements that I want to talk about that frequently get either missed or glossed over a little too much in the ASR has to do, you need to include information about security considerations in the maintenance of your facilities. A lot of people will include, or a lot of institutions will include language about when their buildings are locked and when they're open and patrol of campus housing and things like that, but you also need to include, and it's a little parenthetical, not parenthetical, it's a little phrase in the regulatory language about including information about security considerations in the maintenance of facilities. And I know it seems small, but it is a compliance point. So we recommend talking about things like checking light bulbs, cutting back landscaping, other things that the maintenance team does to improve security. You also need to include complete information about educational programming, and this is separate from the VAWA programming that we'll talk about later. But this is a regulatory requirement for a description of the type and frequency of programs designed to inform students and employees about campus security procedures and practices, and to encourage students and employees to be responsible for their own security and the security of others, and the description of the programs designed to inform students and employees about the prevention of crimes. So again, this sometimes people think when they've covered it with their VAWA programming that they've met this requirement, but this is language about more general security and crime prevention, and a description of that crime prevention programming needs to be included in the ASR. Institutions also need to include a statement about the monitoring through local police agencies of criminal activity at off-campus locations of recognized student organizations. This is another one. We'll see some schools that say, well, we don't have any of these off-campus registered student organizations, so we don't have to include anything about that in the ASR. That's not true. If you don't have any organizations that fit the bill here, you need to say that, and thus there is no monitoring. You also need to include a statement that the institution will disclose to the alleged victim or next of kin of a crime of violence the report on the results of any disciplinary proceeding. This is a requirement of the Higher Education Act. It's not spoken about in the regulations, but it is important nonetheless, and it's something that should be included in your ASR. So we've got our next poll question that I'll let you all read, but it has to do with your drug and alcohol statements in your ASR. So the university has the following statement in its ASR. Is this statement sufficient? XYZ University prohibits the possession, use, and sale of alcoholic beverages for students under the age of 21, as well as the possession, use, and sale of illegal drugs. For further information, please see the university's information for students regarding drug and alcohol abuse education programs found at student DNA at xyz.edu. Is this sufficient for your statement in your ASR about your drug and alcohol programming? I'm going to give you all a minute to answer. Okay, interesting. So you all can see the results on the slide here, and what I should tell you is this was a little bit of a trick question because this is a mistake that we see a lot. This statement, I would argue, is not sufficient because it speaks only to students, And the drug and alcohol portion of your ASR should be relevant to students and employees. That's a mistake that we see a lot, and so this question highlights that. So I want to go into a little bit more detail regarding the policy statements for drugs and alcohol. As I mentioned, the information needs to be for both students and employees, not just students. That's something that we often see. Another thing that institutions often fail to include is language regarding enforcing underage drinking laws and federal and state drug laws. I get that it sounds a little bit funny to say that your institution will enforce underage drinking laws and federal and state drug laws, but the regulation requires that the ASR include a statement of policy regarding the possession, use, and sale of alcoholic beverages and enforcement of state underage drinking laws, and the same for enforcement of federal and state drug laws. That's something that's often overlooked, so we recommend well, for compliance purposes, including language saying about enforcing these laws. In addition, if you need to include all the required elements of the drug and alcohol program either in the ASR or by cross-reference. Like we said earlier, this is the one area of the ASR where you are allowed to reference another document to meet your compliance obligation. However, some institutions still choose to list the required elements of the drug and alcohol program. If you're going to go that route, instead of the cross-referencing route, you need to be sure that all of the elements are there. So you need to include, statements about unlawful possession, clear statements that the institution will impose sanctions for violation, descriptions of the applicable sanctions at the university and at the state, local, and federal law, descriptions of health risks, descriptions of available counseling, treatment, rehabilitation, and reentry programs, and information indicating that the institution performs a biennial review of its drug and alcohol abuse education program. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the required policy statements regarding dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. This is what we sometimes refer to as the VAWA section of the ASR, the Violence Against Women Act. Right out of the box, I want to say that simply cutting and pasting the institution's Title IX policy into this section of the ASR as a general rule will not meet the requirements, the compliance requirements of this section of the ASR. This section of the ASR has many, many compliance points, and we have yet to see a situation where simply including the Title IX policy meets them all. So I want to get that clear right out of the box, and then we're going to go talk about in some detail about the more specific requirements of this section. So one of the things that this section requires is that the institution include the current state laws for the relevant jurisdiction. So that means that the institution needs to include in the ASR the definitions of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, and consent in the applicable jurisdiction. Oftentimes, we'll see institutions include the Clery definitions here. The Clery definitions don't meet the compliance standard. This is intended so that people can read the ASR and know in the relevant jurisdiction what the laws are. So the institution must confirm each year that the state laws that they include here are accurate, as these laws are sometimes subject to change. If your institution has campuses in more than one state or even a foreign location, you need to include the relevant laws for whatever jurisdiction you have campuses. So this can be pretty onerous, updating these each year, but that's something that schools need to be mindful of. Again, these are local jurisdiction or state local jurisdiction laws, not the Clery definitions, and you need to make sure that they're up to date. Institutions also need to include information regarding programming having to do with dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and stalking. I know we talked earlier about general security and crime prevention training. This is the specific VAWA training. You need to include information about your primary prevention and awareness programs, as well as your ongoing prevention and awareness programs. Those two are not the same. They might have similar elements, and that's absolutely fine, but when you're talking about the programming in your ASR, it's important to distinguish between the two and to distinguish the audiences for the two. So if you have some programming that's geared to students and some programming that's geared to employees, you need to specify your intended audience for the programming. You need to describe the programming, excuse me, and you need to, like I said, make sure that you're differentiating between your primary and your ongoing. Because if you lump them together, it looks like you don't know the difference between the two, even if that might not be the case. And in practice, you might be providing all of the appropriate programming. If it's all lumped together in your ASR, the department doesn't know that you know the difference, and that is not good. Again, students and employees. We often see here that people will just include information about the programming for students. You need to include information about programming for employees as well. You also need to include information about no contact orders. Now, in the handbook, as many of you know, there was extensive information about what was required here. The language above, the language on the screen is the regulatory requirement itself. And it is not quite as fulsome as the Clery handbook made it out to be. Certainly if you want to include all the elements that are set forth in the Clery handbook, there's no rule that says you can't do that. I don't think that you have to include that much information. We recommend including at a minimum how to obtain orders in the relevant jurisdiction, how to file them with the institution, how the institution will enforce them, and whether the institution itself issues any kind of no contact order. This is another area where you need to be looking at your the local jurisdiction to see what's required. Boilerplate language won't do here. You need to know, or you need to be able to inform the reader about how to get these no contact orders, and so it needs to be specific to your jurisdiction. So you also need to include in this section of your ASR information about available resources, and these are resources both within the institution and in the community. The ones we most often see people leave out of their ASRs is information about legal assistance. A good piece of information to include here would be a state legal aid organization, for example. That would be a helpful piece of information that would meet the requirement for legal assistance. Another area that we often see people forget to reference is student financial aid. So that's why that's bolded here. You need to include information about sort of what potentially could happen with your student financial aid if there were an issue, say expulsion from school or withdrawal from school, things like that. So we generally recommend a blurb saying, contact the student financial aid office at, and include the contact information, for more information about how an incident might affect your financial aid. That's something that, again, it seems small, but it is a compliance point, and if you miss it, the fines can be significant. The regulations also require a statement that the institution maintain as confidential any accommodations or protective measures provided to a victim, to the extent that maintaining the confidentiality doesn't impair the ability of the institution to provide the accommodations or protective measures. This language here is just sort of a template for language that we recommend that can be helpful in this regard. Again, seems like a small compliance point, but it's important, and sometimes it's hard to know how to word it, so we've provided some suggested language here. So this portion of the ASR is one that is it's one that I see a lot of mistakes in, and so I stress this a lot because this is an area where I feel like it's very easy to trip up, and I don't want anyone to do so. So the regulatory requirement sets forth that you need to include for your disciplinary proceedings the steps, anticipated timelines, how to file the decision-making process, how to file a complaint, the standard of evidence, and how the institution determines which type of proceeding to use for allegations of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. Again, this is an area where people sometimes limit what they put in their ASR to what is in their Title IX policy. And then when I'm reviewing someone's ASR, I'll go look at the Title IX policy, and it'll say, the Title IX policy applies in these circumstances, but in circumstances where the Title IX policy does not apply, we use the student handbook or the employee handbook or our alternate sexual misconduct policy. Obviously, I'm making this up, but it highlights the fact that this section of the ASR needs to apply to any policy that you might use to address allegations of dating violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, or stalking. So if there are policies other than your Title IX policy that might come into play, for example, some colleges and universities might have a policy that applies to a sexual assault that happens on a study abroad program in France. So that wouldn't fall within their Title IX policy, so they have a different policy that would apply. That policy needs to be summarized here. So it's important to remember, because a lot of times what we see is people just relying on their Title IX policy when I think that's not sufficient. That said, your Title IX policy is, of course, very important here, and if you have components of your Title IX policy that allowed for alternate procedures, for example, if you have informal resolution or things like that, those processes should also be outlined here as well. So I'm reiterating the point here. Be sure to include all your relevant procedures and all of the compliance points for all of your relevant procedures and how you choose which procedure to use based on the circumstances at hand. Finally, with regard to sanctions and what the institution may impose, the regulatory language says that institutions need to list all of the possible sanctions that the institution may impose. We frequently see language in ASRs that say, if a student is found to have violated the policy, the sanctions could result in expulsion or punishment up to and including expulsion. We don't like language like that because we think that the department would like you to be far more specific. So we recommend listing, education, probation, suspension, expulsion, anything that could be a potential sanction should be included. The protective measures, you're allowed to cite a range of protective measures. You don't need to list every one of those, but when it comes to the sanctions, you need to be sure to include all of them because that's the compliance standard. Now, they do say that if something changes during the course of the year, you can update the next year what all your sanctions are. But all the sanctions that you know of at the time your ASR is published should be included in the ASR. And now I'm going to turn it over to Haley to talk a little bit about timely warnings and emergency response, among other things.
Thanks, Ellen. So we do see a lot of issues when it comes to annual security reports regarding your policy statements with regard to timely warnings and emergency notifications or emergency response. And specifically that they're not able, the statements don't really differentiate between the two. And so we really think it's important that you understand the difference and what needs to be included in the ASR, because a lot of times, even when we see Clery audits, we see issues that something has been interpreted as a timely warning when it really wasn't a timely warning, or an emergency notification that really was a timely warning. So we see all sorts of documentation errors that then lead to issues within your annual security report. So make sure that you're really very attuned to this issue and following the requirements. I want to break it down for you as to what is required when it comes to a timely warning and emergency response, emergency notification. So you need to make sure that you include the process the institution uses, that your institution uses to confirm that there's a significant emergency, and again, to classify that emergency, the process you use to determine the appropriate segment of campus potentially to receive that notification, to determine the content of the notification, and initiate the notification system. So those are all the elements that have to be in your ASR as to how you're going to go about this process. And then who is responsible for carrying out this process, including a statement that your institution will, without delay, looking at the safety of the community, determine the content of the notification and the system to make sure in their professional judgment that the information is distributed and that that information is clear to the groups or potentially campus that needs to know the information to make sure there's an appropriate response. And so that has to be included in the annual security report. And also, again, if you are audited at any point, we see a common compliance issue that there's not really a way to, they will keep the notifications, but they don't keep the thought process as to how they got to the decision that this is an emergency notification or a timely warning. And so that's important as well as you're looking at what does your documentation look like in this area. Other common mistakes that institutions make at times are that they don't identify the method for notifying the campus, including the larger community if necessary, including information in the ASR as to how you sign up for and receive alerts, and what is the process for doing that at your institution, and what the testing will be for the systems that you have chosen to use, and documenting that you have done those particular tests. That's important as well. And again, some schools just don't include some of this information in their ASR, but say, oh, we have it in our files, we include when we've done our testing, but it's not in our ASR. That's a mistake. You need to make sure that that is included in your annual security report. This policy statement regarding missing students only applies to schools that have on-campus housing, and it's important that you make sure to state in your annual security report several different things about your missing student policy. The first is that you have distinguished between the missing student contact that you would ask the student living on campus for versus just an emergency contact. It can be the same person, but you must ask that individual, that student living on campus, for their missing student contact. You also make sure that you have identified in the annual security report information and how that will be provided to the contact of the missing student. If the student is missing, what information will be provided, and information that would be kept confidential. And then for unemancipated minors, how are you going to contact their parents, and information in your policy statements regarding how you will contact their parents have to be included in the statements as well. We also see a lot of common compliance mistakes regarding policy statements for fire safety. So we've listed a couple of the areas in which we see institutions make these mistakes, specifically if they fail to include the street address of each on-campus housing location. That's an issue. Make sure in your policy statement regarding fire safety that you include contact information for reporting fires that have already occurred, and for each facility to include the number of fires, the cause of that fire, the number of persons receiving medical treatment, any deaths that have resulted, and including property damage as well as you're including that fire safety information. Again, this is the last bullet is an area in which if you don't have any plans for future improvements regarding fire safety, then you need to at least list in your annual on the policy statement that there are no plans. You can't just leave that blank. That is a requirement, and if you do leave it blank, again, can be a compliance concern. All right, so one of the big areas for making sure you have appropriate policy statements is regarding crime statistics. So making sure that you're using current terminology is very important and not past terminology. I've given you some examples in the first bullet point. Making sure that arrests and disciplinary referrals are disclosed separately, that hate crimes that occur that are also primary criminal offenses must be disclosed as both hate crimes and in your regular crime statistics. Other mistakes we see is to make sure that hate crime disclosures include bias, that's included in the disclosure as well. You all know that you need to publish 3 years of crime statistics, and that you are making sure that those statistics are disclosed by the type of Clery geography. So if it's on-campus property, public property, non-campus property, and on-campus student housing. So all of those are important as well. And then the dual report on-campus property and on-campus housing statistics. That's going to be something that people make a lot of mistakes, and it's such an easy thing to catch if you're going through and doing a double check on an annual security report to make sure those numbers align. It's also important, again, to include the record of unfounded crimes, and make sure that you remember this can only, a crime can only be unfounded if a sworn or commissioned law enforcement officer determines that the crime was unfounded. So again, most of the time, a lot of our institutions aren't going to have a lot of unfounded crimes. Finally, we want to talk about correcting the ASR. What if you make a mistake and you've made some sort of, or you've missed one of the policy statements, or you've made some other type of mistake? From the Clery handbook, you must update your ASR if you need to make corrections to your statistics or change any of the safety and security policies. You must add a note to the ASR that's explaining the change, and it must be redistributed. And that's what every administrator does not want to hear, but that's what we tell every administrator when we determine that there's a mistake or a change. I've had people that have called me on October 2nd and say, we just published yesterday, or we published 2 days ago, and now we found that we have a mistake. What do we do? And the answer is the same, is that you should update, you should explain, and then you've got to redistribute. And so I think that's important. That is from the Clery handbook, which again, provided the safe harbor. The FSA appendix and regulations are silent when it comes to corrections. So that is what we think is the best practice, to follow the Clery handbook still, but it is going to be a determination, and some schools don't want to redistribute, and so they will, maybe roll the dice to determine whether or not, somebody is going to catch that and not redistribute if they've made a particular mistake. So making sure that you have talked through what happens if we have a mistake, and understanding as an institution what your position is going to be regarding a mistake, I think can be really important. Again, when the handbook was in place, it still can serve as a safe harbor. It was pretty clear what needed to happen. Now I think it's a little less clear. Ellen, anything you want to add on this? Because I think this is where we do get a lot of pushback at times from our institutions about having to redistribute and republish the ASRs.
Yes, I would just stress what you said, Haley. I think I think some of it depends on the timing. I think if you discover a mistake September 20th, then, you know, just go ahead and fix it in your upcoming ASR. But if you discover a mistake on October 15th, I think the best course of action is to redistribute. I think it can't hurt you to redistribute, so that would be my recommendation.
I agree. Thanks, Ellen. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
So now that we've sort of gone through the compliance points of the ASR, we're going to dive a little bit more deeply into some interpretive gray areas and other questions that we get really frequently that are hard and that require a little wrestling with. So as Haley mentioned earlier, geography is often a sticking point for institutions. We get a lot of questions about geography. And recently, particularly with the rescission of the Clery handbook, we've gotten many, many questions about school trips. This is an area that can seem quite unclear. So let's start by first talking about a little bit about non-campus buildings or property, because that kind of lays the foundation for most school trip questions. So non-campus property can be a building or property owned or controlled by a student organization officially recognized by the institution, or most likely to come up in the trip context is any building or property owned or controlled by an institution used in support of or in relation to the institution's educational purposes, frequently used by students, and not within the same reasonably contiguous geographic area as the institution. As many of you likely know, the Clery handbook was filled with guidance about trips. Repeated one-night stays versus a single one-night stay, and short stay-away trips that lasted more than one night, and when those were considered your Clery geography and when they weren't. The FSA Appendix has an interesting statement. It says, well, it's actually the intro to the FSA Appendix. The appendix has also addressed the issues identified in the above referenced Senate report. It was a Senate report that was calling out some issues with the Clery handbook regarding reporting crimes that occurred during sponsored stay-away trips and similar mandates placed upon trips to international destinations that require institutions to obtain crime statistics from foreign law enforcement agencies. Well, I think that the way the appendix addressed the issue was by not addressing it at all. And so we're really left with the regulatory language, and institutions need to decide what it means to them for a location. We think the primary question is, what does it mean to be frequently used by students? And I think that might vary depending on the institution, but for example, a study abroad location where students stay for 6 weeks or a full semester seems more likely to fall into the category of what the department would consider non-campus property than maybe a long weekend mission trip that happens once in the history of the school. That location would be less likely to be considered non-campus property. We recommend relying heavily on the definition of non-campus property as stated in the regulations and making consistent decisions across campus properties for what is considered frequently used by students. For example, if you have a week-long trip to Ohio and a week-long trip to Paris, and your campus is in Mississippi, I wouldn't categorize those two trips differently, assuming that they meet all the requirements, the other requirements for non-campus property. Trips of the same length should be categorized the same way, and we recommend keeping documentation to justify your decision. Another area where we get lots of questions has to do with what constitutes a separate campus. And again, the Clery handbook had a lot of guidance. They talked about ownership or control of the space, not reasonably contiguous. There's an organized program of study and at least one person on site acting in administrative capacity. The FSA Appendix is different. It barely references separate campuses at all. It simply says that, if you have a separate location, not within a reasonably contiguous area, it would be considered a separate campus for reporting purposes. We think that this language, obviously, again, you can still use the, for non-campus property trips, for separate campuses, you can still use the language that's set forth in the Clery handbook if you want to. That is a safe harbor. But with the rescission of this, the handbook, we do think that institutions have more flexibility to determine what constitutes a separate campus. For example, if you have 2 classes at a location that lead to a degree and an administrator on site under the handbook, that would be considered a separate campus, but maybe under the FSA appendix, your institution chooses to interpret that differently and not identify it as a separate campus because it's not a branch campus or a school within the institution. And so we think you do have some more flexibility there. Again, we think consistency is key. We think getting stakeholder input, like, for example, if you've got someone running a program in a different location, talking to them about whether it seems to be a separate campus for these purposes, that's helpful information to have and should be weighed in your decision-making process. And again, document your decision and keep the documentation on hand. Another area where we get lots of questions is campus security authorities and whether a particular employee or a particular title, a particular job title would be considered a CSA. So by way of background, the regulations define a CSA to include your campus police or security department, that makes sense, other individuals responsible for campus security, individual or organization to which student and employees are instructed to report criminal offenses, so that, that also makes sense. And then the one that gets tricky is an official of an institution who has significant responsibility for student and campus activities, including but not limited to student housing, student discipline, and campus judicial proceedings. This is another area where the Clery handbook provided a lot of information, and it was determined at some point that the handbook went a little beyond the regulations. But the handbook included in the definition of a CSA any person who has the authority and the duty to take action or respond to particular issues on behalf of the institution. The appendix, however, says that the department will defer to an institution's designation of CSAs as authoritative. Institutions should focus on the significant responsibilities of an employee when determining whether that employee is a CSA. So we have some recommendations to help you for determining CSAs. First, obviously, rely on the definition set forth in the regulation. That goes without saying, so it's not included here in the bullets, but be consistent with your decisions. So look for similarities of positions among departments and categories, among departments, and categorize those employees the same way. So internal consistency is important here. Document your CSA decisions. So once you've made a determination that a particular title or a particular level of employee is a CSA, document that so you have it to refer to. Once determined, include all CSAs in any CSA-related correspondence. All CSAs should be treated the same because their expectations are the same regardless of what their job is. And then strongly consider providing CSA training. That is not a regulatory or statutory requirement, but we've seen in finding letters from the department that it's nearly impossible to have an effective Clery compliant program without providing CSA training. So we really recommend doing that. And like the appendix and the introduction to the appendix say, they're going to defer to the institution as long as the institution is looking at the definition of what is a CSA, and like I said, we think documenting that decision is extremely important. So this is our final poll question of the webinar. The University Title IX coordinator concerned about victim confidentiality has asked the chief of police is responsible for Clery compliance if she can report Clery crimes that occur on Clery geography to University Police in aggregate form at the end of each semester for inclusion in the ASR. Is this permissible under the Clery statute and its implementing regulations? And I'm going to give you all a little bit of time to respond to this and time to read it. Okay, now I'm going to close it out. Okay, so y'all can see the results on the screen. The correct answer, we believe, is no, and I'm going to talk about why. So generally speaking, CSAs, and your Title IX coordinator is very, very likely going to be a CSA. Your CSAs have reporting requirements. The Clery regulations state that an institution must report to the campus community in a manner that is timely Clery crimes reported to CSAs considered by the institution to represent a threat to students and employees. The institution cannot meet its requirement for getting that information to the campus community if the Title IX coordinator is reporting Clery crimes in aggregate at the end of each semester. So pastoral and professional counselors, when acting in their capacities, are not considered CSAs, so they don't have an obligation to report. But any other CSA, including if your victim advocates are CSAs, if your Title IX coordinator is a CSA, if they are CSAs, they have an obligation to report, and they must do so in a timely fashion so that the institution can meet its obligations under the Clery Act. Note that the Clery Handbook says that reports can be made without personally identifying information. Most of the time, that is the case, and so that addresses concerns about confidentiality that the Title IX coordinator is often going to be concerned about.
So I've talked a lot today about being audited, so I just wanted to go quickly through what will happen if your institution does get audited. And there's a couple of different ways in which you can be notified of that. First, if you have been in the news recently, you can get a spot check audit review or spot check review as to how you handled a particular issue. That's the first way. Also, people can reach out to the department because they are complaining about the institution or potentially lack of compliance. And then finally, you can have a Title IV program review, and as part of that, and it's important that your federal financial aid office understand that Clery will be part of that and that your Clery team needs to be involved if you get notified of an actual program review. So if you're notified that you are going to be audited and you have really a focused Clery review, the process can take, on average 2 to 3 years plus. And because of COVID, the department is even, there's even a longer period of time. And typically you'll get a notice of the Clery review and a list of, and it's a very lengthy list of the documents that they want to see prior to the visit. And the visit has already been scheduled before you get the notice. And so it is very difficult, if not impossible, to change or to delay the visit when they've already assigned the auditors that are going to go there. They come on campus. It can take anywhere from 3 to 5 days. Some schools they're there 3 weeks or even come back multiple times. Some schools, they've even had office hours at their schools. Then the department takes all the information gathered back and does its analysis, and then ultimately does a preliminary review report. And this is going to be the PRR that actually you get information from and you get to respond to as an institution. So you'll have time to then respond to any inaccuracies within that preliminary document. Then after reviewing that, the department will review your response and then ultimately issue a final program review determination, in which they then, after that step is done, goes on to determining what if any, fine would be assessed. And then finally, the institution gets the ability to appeal and even potentially negotiate with the department regarding the fine amount. So it's a very long, complicated process that happens when you go through this process. Ellen, I knew we would run out of time, and we did. We're already over time, so I'm sorry again. We will try to respond to your questions via email that you've had. We did want to let you know that if you're interested and would be interested in a free demo, there's a couple dates coming up for the Clery Compliance Toolset that we work with. Anastasia Caffrey at Husch Blackwell can answer any questions regarding that. But if you're interested, there's a QR code to sign up for it. And we do appreciate your attendance today. Finally, just make sure if you do have questions to submit those questions via the question icon. I really want to thank Ellen for joining me today. Ellen is a wealth of information when it comes to Clery, and thank you very much for being here, Ellen. As a reminder too, I want to remind you that this program has been approved for continuing legal education credit. Again, go to the CEU icon at the bottom of your screen and make sure you report your credit. A certificate of attendance of this webinar will be emailed to you tomorrow along with the recording for viewing and sharing at your institution. And again, please complete our short survey just so we can get feedback on what you're interested in hearing about. We have, as many of you know, we have monthly webinars and are always looking for topics in which you are interested in and would be helpful to your institutions. So with that, again, thank you again, Ellen, and this concludes our webinar.